All right, we are here today to listen to Barak read us Act 1, Chapter 8, Number 4, AODHAN. Something I'm looking very much forward to.
Well, thank you. Is it because AODHAN ends with Dan? Tell us the truth.
I might have, some interest in this character, but not just because it's named after me.
The people that are here should know that this fantasy book actually honors the names of characters from a Dungeons and Dragons campaign that I ran, and Dan was playing a character in who was named AODHAN, and so it's this character in this book honors Dan's creation that way, and so
not AODHAN. Course.
Not AODHAN, but I will say welcome AODHAN and Shireen who are joining us. So we have some new participants, and they're also hosting us. So thank you, very much appreciated. It's a lovely location in Oakland, California, and so that's really where that is. A little bit of about this chapter. So this is the, going back to Ariel's famous analogy now, the turning light bulb. This is basically the last corner of the room where the light bulb is going to shine a light on before the next chapter where I'm going to turn on the light switch and we're going to get to see the room. So it's in the building of the suspense for this is hopefully it's working for anybody who's listened to any of this before.
Yeah.
And if you haven't listened to any of this before, of course you should. But ultimately, it is right now the first act of this book is laying a tapestry. So I am switching around from various places in this world and in the timeline and just saying, hey, look at this. This is a thing that just happened, completely unrelated to any other thing that has happened. Or this is a person that stands on their own and isn't related to anybody else in this world as far as the reader or the listener is concerned. And so in many ways, these first 9 chapters, this is the 8th of them, are a series of short stories. It's a very easy way to jump into this book. You don't necessarily have to hear them in order, although I do recommend you hear all the first 8 before you get to the 9th, which I haven't read out loud yet, because the 9th kind of ties a lot of loose ends together. Papa, when do we go hunting? Fergus looked at his son, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor, and smiled at him lovingly from his chair. You know, AODHAN, that's an excellent question. You're surely almost ready. Fergus's voice trailed off as a look of concern crept across his wizened, kindly face. But when will I actually be ready? AODHAN lifted his head and pleaded with his father. His round brown eyes were wide open. As his smooth black hair was tossed backwards, the big scar running down the left side of his otherwise childlike face glinted in the candlelight. Oh, you gotta let the boy go at it for real, Fergus. His mother, who had apparently been listening quietly in the shadows near the doorway, suddenly spoke. Her soft voice seemed to startle them both. He ain't a wee boy anymore, you know. AODHAN climbed up to his feet. At roughly 6 feet tall, he towered over both of his parents. See, Papa, even Mama knows, he said. It's not fair. All the other kids... Don't talk to me about the other kids, Fergus cut him off. You are not like them, AODHAN, and you know it. You're special. He turned towards his wife and raised his palms helplessly. Isla, help me here, dear. She did not respond. AODHAN stood his ground, looking defiant. I don't care. If they are old enough to die, then I am old enough to hunt. The room descended into an uncomfortable silence. Then the mother spoke again. Fergus, I think it's time to. He be 30 soon. He can hunt. She said, took a long breath, and then added with a note of sadness, and we could use the extra food. Winter is by. AODHAN turned to look back towards his father, his face triumphant. Fergus sighed. All right, AODHAN, we'll go hunting tomorrow, he said. Then he sighed again. AODHAN yelped with joy and kissed his father on the forehead, cupping Fergus's silver mane in his hands as he did so. Then he took 2 steps towards his mother and wrapped his arms around her tightly, lifting her up from the floor. Put me down now, silly boy, she giggled, and go make yourself useful. AODHAN grabbed the empty bucket in the corner and moved quickly towards the doorway. As he opened the door and ran outside, he started whistling, and his hair flew back again, revealing both his scar and his mangled, slightly pointed ears. Fergus had taught him well. Aidan could hack and slash his way through a jungle of trees or of people, his thrust and aim as sure as that of any of Lavatown's police, even if his moves were somewhat wasteful due to his lack of formal training. Even his weaker hand could cause significant damage, and he always carried a sharp bone dagger at his left side for easy access. But what he really loved was his bow. With careful instruction from his father, he had spent several years making one bow after another, learning how the wood should flex, how the carve could inspire greater tension and power, how the bend could instill stability. Every time, after weeks of hard work, he would proudly show his creation to Fergus, who would examine it with an expert craftsman's critical eye, turning it this way and that before tossing it aside. He would always reject them. Initially, Aidan became frustrated, even angry at his father, as one after another of his bows ended up as firewood used to cook up dinner. But after the first few years, he started to appreciate the flaws that Fergus was seeing, which led to Aidan's greatest period of continuing improvement. He began to feel the wood in a new way, caressing the grain and finding the invisible inflection points that would, sometimes quite literally, make or break a bow. He found himself reading patterns with his fingers and letting the wood tell him where the strings should go, how taut it had to be, where the grip would best balance the wishes of the arrow as it would take flight. His creations improved markedly. Every bow was still rejected, although they no longer ended up as mere firewood-worthy discards. Fergus had by then taught him how to sell, how to find someone in the shallows to buy his bows, netting them some much-needed cash or supplies to support the household. With both his parents aging fast, it was critical for their family's survival, but Aidan also understood that through this process, his father had given him a valuable trade. Each new bow was ever more lovely, and his skill with wood rose markedly. It was almost as if, under his careful touch, he could arrange a bow in exactly the right way to become perfectly harmonious, with every point and every fiber complementing each other. A trained archer knocking an arrow to one of Aidan's bows would find it falling naturally into precisely the right placement without any need of adjustment or examination, and it would shoot straight and true without any undue effort. Aidan's bows became known, and people from the higher districts would occasionally come to the shallows to seek them out. By the time he was 34, he even had an adventurer, one of those mysterious figures who risked life and limb in the most dangerous, uncharted parts of the world, fighting terrible monsters while looking for fabled artifacts, or simply to steal their buried treasure, pay him enough for his latest creation to replace the roof on their small house. The bow was a marvel and incorporated his most recent innovation, a clever trick through which a well-trained archer could shoot 2 arrows at once, doubling their chances of dropping their target with a single pull of the string. The adventurer loved it. He bought it on the spot, not even caring about the outrageous amount of money being asked. Aidan had quoted that number as a joke, fully expecting the adventurer to laugh. The adventurer didn't laugh. Yet his father still didn't think that the bow was good enough, nor the 2 dozen that followed. He kept rejecting them, and Aidan kept selling them, although no one ever paid nearly as much as the adventurer did. Until this one. It was his 273rd attempt. It was the finest bow he had ever made. It had every feature he had come up with, all executed to perfection. His mastery of the wood that had allowed his bows to be so much lighter and yet stronger than any other that he had ever seen. His special grip, which could adjust with the right finger pressure to trained range for impact. His double arrow trick improved even more in that an extremely well-trained archer could now use it to hit 2 separate targets as long as they were no more than 20 degrees apart. And his most impressive feat, a slave string that could be used in conjunction with the special grip, if you knew exactly what you were doing, to impart on a single arrow a spin that would allow it to curve slightly in flight. An expert marksman could use this feature to hit something or someone that hid behind a bush or around a corner. He had been designing this feature for years and had finally put it in place. He was rather proud of it. When he presented the bow to his father, he fully expected another rejection. He had resigned himself to being a bow maker, which wasn't a bad trade to have. He also felt that this bow was special enough that he could perhaps get another hefty fee for it. Instead, as Fergus took the bow into his hands, his look of examination turned not into the usual disdain, but rather into contemplation. He lifted the bow and rested it on his index finger, letting it wobble slightly. He looked at it for a long time, his eyes traveling from one end to the other, as he brought up his other hand and moved it all over. not quite touching the bow, but clearly sensing it nonetheless, becoming one with it. Aidan knew that feeling well. Then Fergus brought the bow slowly towards him, leaning over and smelling it, before letting it drop gently into his lap. He gave out a small, satisfied sigh and crossed his hands over it. Then he looked up at his son, smiled, and nodded. Aidan thought his heart was going to burst out of his chest with joy. Hunting had become his respite, and his new bow made him extremely deadly. People from the shallows didn't usually venture out of Lava Town. For one thing, the toll fees to take even the cheapest routes to the surface were prohibitive for most. That route, which required a dangerous climb via a rickety rope and wooden staircase that snaked upwards along the southern edge of the gash, doubling over itself countless times as it disappeared into the sky, cost 20 coppers. A trifle for most people, but a fortune in the shallows, where such an amount would feed an entire family for more than a week if they spent it carefully. Not to mention that every year, a fair number of people would die as they fell off the staircase. The city generally viewed this as a reasonable outcome. Having fewer shallows residents certainly didn't bother anyone. That was also why they rarely bothered to fix anything, even as some of the steps developed dangerous-looking cracks. Crews would only make repairs when one of those steps broke clean through, hurtling its unfortunate occupant hundreds of feet to their death below. Or in the rarer case, when a clumsy traveler grabbed the guide rope to save themselves, only to discover that the belay that secured the staircase to the volcano had been weakened by weather and previous desperate rope grabs. The unfortunate climber would then similarly and conveniently plummet to oblivion. In Lava Town's cynical fashion, they charged the toll as you began your ascent and called it the stairway to heaven. Still, it was cheap enough that he had used it a few times with his father, who had taught him how, by relying on his ever-increasing affinity for wood, to navigate it safely. Eventually, as the income he would bring in from his bows grew, they could afford the next cheapest route, a long and winding, mostly natural tunnel, almost 2 miles long. It followed the natural contours of the mountain and surrounding countryside until it finally emerged not a quarter mile away from the lip of the volcano and the city gates. The tunnel was not lit or ventilated, and you had to carry a torch which gave you a lungful of smoke as you made your way to one of the 2 ocean overlooks without guardrails that served as brakes along the path. It was also shut down at night as nocturnal critters flooded the tunnel, but it was still a much safer way out of the shallows if all you needed was to get beyond the city proper. Going that way cost 10 times as much, but as Aidan's bow making still improved, so did their catch. The trip became affordable. And once they got up there, oh, how he loved hunting. He quickly became an excellent woodsman. His father was good, but Aidan's marksmanship improved to the point where Fergus stopped actively hunting and simply served as guide and occasional spotter, even though he was a more experienced hunter than Aidan. This also allowed his father to focus on his search for something that he refused to discuss despite Aidan's repeated inquiries, saying only that Aidan will know when he finds it. They were selling most of their bounty primarily to the Steadfast Inn by the docks. It was a busy place and prided itself on meals that were fresh. They began to pay the extra toll to take a small cart with them through the tunnel, and when they returned in the evening, it would be full of deer, rabbits, and birds of all kinds. After a couple of years of supplying the inn, he got to know its owner, a dwarf called Bavin. That was how he discovered that the Steadfast Inn had a particular interest in exotic meats and would pay especially well for those. He never quite understood why anyone would care for goblin flesh, for example, but one of these dangerous creatures would fetch an enormous sum. So from that point onwards, instead of hiding from goblins, Aidan and Fergus looked for an opportunity to nail one. Aidan's skill with his bow was such that when he caught a marauding goblin for the first time, the affair was entirely humdrum, perhaps even boring. He used a double arrow and adjusted his grip such that the goblin more than 200 feet away was struck simultaneously in both the heart and the eye, and died instantly. Not that there were too many goblins traveling around the Lava Town Peninsula. Still, for Aidan and his father, coming upon one was cause not for fear, but for celebration. He no longer feared anything. He knew his bow would always save them. So when the werewolf killed his father, it came as a complete shock. It was midday on another one of their hunting trips, and they were in a clearing roasting some freshly killed pigeon when suddenly they heard a howl. It sounded like a wolf. They had killed plenty of wolves. Aidan reached for his bow. Fergus tensed up. "What's wrong, Papa?" Aidan asked. That howl, son, Fergus said. It's not a normal wolf. Huh? Aidan was puzzled. The wolf howled again, this time much closer. He estimated it was near the edge of the clearing where it was hidden by the foliage, not even 60 feet away. Fergus jumped to his feet. It's a werewolf, he said urgently. Go, Aidan, your bow will be no good here. He drew his sword, the half-silvered blade gleaming in the sunlight, lowering himself into a battle stance. Go, I tell you. Aidan was confused, but did as his father ordered. He didn't know what a werewolf was, nor why Fergus told him to leave. They had never separated during their hunts, but he trusted his father, so he picked up his bow and started walking towards the opposite edge of the clearing. Then he heard behind him the sound of bushes splitting apart, stopped and turned around to look. Walking slowly into the clearing was the largest, most menacing wolf that he had ever seen. It must have been 4 feet tall at the nape, and its head was enormous. But it wasn't that, or the rippling muscles, or the gleaming yellow teeth dripping with saliva. It was the wolf's impossibly intelligent eyes, assessing and calculating in a way that no animal should. It was almost human. Aidan brought his bow up and notched 2 arrows. Fergus, squaring off against the wolf, barked over his shoulder, "Run, boy, run! Your arrows can't hurt it." He let the arrows loose anyway, and they flew straight and true and hit the wolf right where he intended, one in the right eye and the other right under the jawline and into the neck. It was a precise, powerful, deadly strike, one that could have dropped an elephant. Instead, he watched in disbelief as the arrows bounced off harmlessly. The wolf grinned. Then it lunged towards his father. "Run!" Fergus shouted. "Now!" He ran. The sounds behind him spoke of a fierce contest, but by the time he'd climbed the nearest tree and could look back, it was all over. The wolf was clearly hurt, with the blood from several deep wounds marking its thick fur, and it was breathing heavily. But it had his father on the ground, immobilized under its massive front paw, and its maw descended for a powerful bite. Over the next 30 seconds, Aidan shot his entire quiver at the wolf in frustration and fear. Every single one of them hit its intended target. Every single one of them did exactly the same thing as did the first 2, bouncing off the creature harmlessly. The wolf looked in his direction and made a terrible cackling sound. Is it laughing at me? Even through his mounting despair, Aidan was incredulous. Then Fergus stared and shouted, "Find the talisman!" And the werewolf bit down and tore his father limb from them. His mother's grief was even harder to bear than his own. There was nothing he could do to comfort her. She passed away a fortnight later from a broken heart. Before she died, she revealed to him gently that Fergus wasn't really his father. "We tried our best," she whispered to him as she lovingly touched his scarred ears, no longer having the strength to speak. She told him that they did it to hide the fact that he had elven blood, to save him from being picked on by the other kids. Even angry as this revelation made him, he couldn't quite muster the strength to ask her if it meant that she had him with someone else, or who it might be. As for the talisman, all she could tell him that Fergus was obsessed with the idea that there was something out there in the wild that he needed to find, and it was somehow connected to Aidan. By that time, she was no longer quite lucid, and she didn't speak another word before passing away the next morning. It was the eve of what, now that he knew his elven roots, should have been his thrice-teen. Then the fires came. Aidan continued to make and sell bows, hunt and sell meat. He'd also found a private tutor who taught him how to read properly, and then used his notoriety as master artisan to join the library that was set up after the fires between the Steadfast Inn and the Classy Lassie. Many of the books came from old Yoro's house and somehow survived even as the building around them burned to cinder. Most folks assumed that magical words were what saved them. He read anything he could find about talismans, which wasn't much. He also continued to hunt, yet always found himself searching around for something that he couldn't quite describe. What the talisman looked like he didn't know, nor why it mattered so much. But as he continued to read, he learned and began to understand the power of these mystical items. He developed a feeling that he would know it when he found it, that if, as his father had said, it was connected to him, then the talisman would make itself known to him when the time came. Through all of this, his knowledge of bows and the wood they were made from continued to grow. Now he was in front of the inn again, but now it is midday and he is here for a new purpose. Yesterday, when he emerged from the tunnel right around dusk with a cart full of game, some scamp waiting for him right outside the toll booth approached and delivered the message. It's read simply, "Dear Bowmaker, we wish to extend to you a business offer which should be of significant benefit to both parties. Please join us tomorrow at the Steadfast Inn for a conversation." It included a time and a strange sigil, most likely representing whomever it was that sought him out. He didn't recognize it. Why not, he thought. I can take a rest from hunting. And that's the story of Aidan.
Nice.
Wow,
It's fun.
it is.
Oh, stand by one. Nicely done, Barak.
Yeah.
Thank you.
As usual. A couple of thoughts come to my mind right away, and if I don't say them, I'm going to forget them.
Go ahead.
Once again, when you start and I start to develop a mind's eye picture of the characters, there's three of them in the beginning, and then you throw something in that's like, oh wait, they're not like I pictured, like the silver mane. He put there's a mane on this individual. I'm sorry?
That's his father's silver mane.
Yes. So obviously there's a mane on this individual, and I was just thinking, no, just like normal haircut like mine. Have you spent time with archery yourself? Because you talk like an expert. Or the way you describe some of this stuff, or at least more, it's a relative thing, right? It's kind of I have no clue about archery, but the way you went into some of the detail, but not too far, it really it built a picture of why it was important.
So you're saying I'm a good bullshitter. Excellent. I love it.
Oh, we all know that.
I was gonna say.
It sounded like you did
No, I did some research. Yes, I
Yeah.
did. It's true. Anything I engage in this book is that I don't know anything about. We will get to a chapter way down the road about a bridge, and I talk about bridge construction. And I can tell you, I spent an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out, how to deal with that. So it's true that I read a whole bunch about archery, and then I infused it with the things that are fantastical, right? You cannot build a bow in this world that will have a thing that will make the bow curve around and hit somebody.
That was so cool.
Right?
No, it reminded me of the sound shifter kind of a thing. Like people who are into archery probably wish they could do what you said.
Right.
Right, which is the theme, right? It's a theme, right? It's the same thing that happened with Niall, right? With her music.
Yep, that's what I meant. Yeah, that was. I'm going to unpin you so I can see everybody else.
I mean, there's also I wonder if you picked, because you brought it up, right? When we did the werewolf chapter, and we did, right, the randomness of nature. Remember when you said that, and I was like, oh, I can't wait for you to hear the next one, right? Because this is the randomness of nature, right? They're just there, eating their lunch.
Well, the randomness of nature was actually your words, but it really resonated, and it made that. Wow, I get that. That was a thing.
So I'm gonna ask actually the two of you. I mean, you kind of like your first exposure to this. Any reactions?
I immediately was able to see the environment that you painted such a vivid picture of where we were, and I'm already ready for the screenplay. Like, let's get this made.
It's funny.
It's
Other visuals.
really beautiful.
So does that mean you might want to try and go listen to the
Oh
previous
yeah,
7?
absolutely. Yeah.
All right. I've told you all these things. I've shown you all these various corners of the tapestry, which are either a person. So there are 5. The reason the book is called 5 is 5 protagonists. There's 5 heroes, right? This is the 4th hero. The next chapter introduces the 5th hero and also introduces the setting, like fully.
Okay.
So in the next chapter, you will actually learn what Lavaton is really like, what crazy place, because there's a lot of little crazy things here. What is the gash? Wait, it's in the middle of a volcano. What is this weird staircase that you just described? This cynical city. It's the next chapter that's gonna put it all together and give you this view of this place, and it is a very fantastical place. So I'm looking forward to people's reactions who have been through this journey with us thus far. and you can catch up, of
Yeah.
course, right, on the channel, to see how that translates. Because that is sort of like one of my big moments, right? Holy shit, here's a reveal, guys.
Yeah.
You know, you spent all this time with me. Thank you. Let me show you.
And one of the things I love probably most about this chapter is specifically when you're talking about going into the woods and what goes down going into the woods and the energy that you put into describing what's happening. It's like it really is transporting you there. And it's I think the next bit I'm really looking forward to hearing is where Aiden takes this, this thing he's just starting to figure out, right? And where it goes in the next chapters as the story proceeds. So
what Dan was just saying about like that transportation, Iran showing, I don't know if you listened to the last chapter, Werewolf,
No.
but it was super intense in an animalistic kind of viewpoint or different perspective. And it really did what Daniel was just talking about. It took you to like, all right, this isn't a human narrating this now. It was the werewolf talking about, I really want that baby. I really want, and it was intense and it was scary.
Yeah.
And it was Brock, don't sell yourself short. You were just talking about the reason this is a fantasy is because of the scrambling of senses. But case in point, the thing you just did with the arrows, like there are two, and this part of the bow makes one spin that way, so it can curve. That's fantasy. And the shapeshifter, the sound shifter, once a note leaves the instrument, that the person could then tailor it to an individual. That's fantasy too. Maybe that's scrambling the senses in your context, but all these different facets make this like something I've never heard before. I've never. It's unique.
No, I mean, thank you. I hope it's unique.
Well, and at the same time as it's scrambled, it also feels like they also have something in common. Like there's a patterning feeling in it as I'm hearing it.
Yeah, I mean,
Springs eternal.
Oh,
Go ahead.
To me, when the word goblin was introduced, then it's like, oh, okay. It's up to then, it's like they're like human, but something's off. It's not quite right. Like even the fact that the age, his age, his father's, it's like the way they treat him at that age. That's not human.
Well, that's because he has the elven blood. He just didn't know that, right? The mangled ears that his parents basically tried to cut off the pointy ends when he was a baby, or a child, or whenever they adopted him, right? So that
I did not pick that up. I didn't
up.
conclude that.
I thought he had some accident or something.
Yeah.
That's unfortunate because that is an important piece of Aiden's.
Now I get it. No, because they were trying to protect him. I get it because some of the other dialogue. I get it.
Right. They were trying to protect him from being picked on, and so they literally came and tried to cut off the top of his ears. I'm using fantasy tropes that everybody's familiar. You've seen Lord of the Rings, so you know what a goblin looks like, right? So I'm giving you some grounding.
Yeah.
But it's not the world we're in. It's enough to
spice.
It's a little bit, right?
alternate universes.
But then I screw with it, right? So that's what's going to happen.
Familiarity for us to get some grounding, and then you rip out that carpet out from under our feet.
Yeah, pretty much. But this goes back to the conversation we had about elves, right? And about werewolves and how I'm changing them in a way that I think makes more sense. But it's another elf problem, right? Elven kids adopted by human parents who live, human parents in my world live to be 70 if they're long lived. Their elven child lives to be 1,000.
Yeah.
Right? How do you deal with that problem?
Yeah.
Right? I've never seen fantasy books deal with these things. And so it's another one of those moments for me where I can say, hey, here's what it might look like. The human parents might actually try to hide the fact that their kid has elven blood, right? And that's how they might do it.
I'm intrigued from werewolves to double arrows. I think the journey is getting exciting.
All right, so we just heard the book 5 by Barak, Act 1, Chapter 8, number 4, Aiden. Next time we will be hearing Act 1, Chapter 9, 5, Garrett. But if you enjoyed what you heard here today, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can keep up with the story.
Oh, wow. That sounds kind of
Yeah.
professional. I don't think anybody's done that yet. Tell your friends. Cool. All right. Well, thank you, folks.